I think we're recording now, which is good. So I thought about when we go through, if you guys can do me a favor, if you can, first of all, if you can mute your microphones, everyone, I'm happy to have your video cameras on, that's absolutely fine, but if you can mute your mics so we don't get any background noise. What we're going to do then, the order of play today, I did think about whether we go through some of the homework images first, but you've all been really good and sent in, I've got like about 65 images, which is quite a lot. So I'm not going to be able to review them all, but what I'm going to do is deliver the main bit of the course first of all. And if we lap over into the Q&A session to do some of the homework review, then I think that will work better. You've then got the option, you can hang around on the call as long as you want. Obviously, it's entirely up to you. You can disappear at any point in time. But I think if we do look at your images later, then I'm not going to feel under pressure. If I spend 40 minutes, as I could do, going through your images from homework, we're going to have to then cram an hour's worth of content into 20 minutes. And some of you might need to disappear at certain times. So that's the logic behind the plan today. So in a second, we'll jump right in. And let me just get the screen share up. My screen rather than my slightly yellow looking face. Bear with me. Okay, right, so hopefully you guys can all see the screen. If for any reason you guys can't see a page that says the exposure triangle on it, then someone unmute your microphone and shout. I'm using the laptop mic just in case the microphone was at fault last week, but we should be on a more reliable Wi-Fi connection this week as well. So if there are issues, it's possibly your end. Not ruling out the possibility this might go in and out, but we'll see how it goes. And if it's better this week, let me know at the end, and I'll do it here next week again as well. Right, okay, guys. So this is where I need your full concentration. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk you through the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is basically what you need to get an understanding of to get the correct exposure on an image. Now, there are three things that I'm going to break down and go through each of them and give you examples of each that compose the triangle. The first is shutter speed, the second is aperture, and the third is ISO or ISO, depending on how you want to say it. I say ISO myself, so that's what you'll have to get used to. Right, so first of all, we're going to dig into the first one, which is probably the most self-explanatory, which is shutter speed. So on your camera, you will have, possibly not for those shooting on phones, but for anyone with even a point and shoot camera up through a bridge camera to any of the SLRs, will have the ability to change the shutter speed manually. Now, if you are, so the way that this is sort of designated, the way this is written is, as you can see on here, is a 1 next to a number. So what we've got here is 1 second at this end through to 1/2000th of a second at this end. And it goes without saying that a shutter being open for 1/2000th of a second, that shutter is going to be open for a lot less time than if it's open for a second. When the shutter is open, and in the case of 2,000th of a second, it happens so quickly, it's, you're barely going to notice it. It lets light in. So if it's open for a very short space of time, a smaller amount of light is going to hit the sensor, which is going to generally result in a darker image. If you open the shutter for a full second, then that is letting more light in, so you're going to end up with a brighter image. So having that understanding is really important, because your shutter speed is going to dictate the amount of blur in your images. Now, for most of what we want to be photographing, in most cases, the exception being things like fireworks, possibly if you're photographing cars, motorsport, and you want that kind of, you want to pan around with the camera so you can create the illusion of movement and have the wheels kind of blurred, but the actual car's fixed. But really, other than that sort of stuff, most of the time you're going to want that image to be sharp. You're not going to want to see blur. It's going to look more amateur if you've got blur in images when it's not supposed to be there. So yes, you can get creative with photography. I remember standing up on top of the station at, I think, King's Cross, and I'd put my camera on a tripod, and I'd lock in the focus on somebody that was stood really still, and I'd set a really low shutter speed, like a second, take the exposure, and the person remaining still would be sharp, and everyone else moving around would be blurred, and it would create this kind of cool arty effect. So there are times you might want a slow shutter speed. I think fireworks, typically, I think if I'm photographing them, I try and open the shutter for somewhere between 1 second and 2 seconds, so you can actually get the movement of the firework. But if you're photographing anything where there is fast movement, and it's worth bearing in mind things like photographing pets, for example. Pets move generally quicker than humans do. Kids run around really, really quickly, so you're going to want a high shutter speed photographing them, and any sport as well. You're going to want to freeze that action. So there are different kind of rules that I put in place for my photography for how fast I want that shutter speed to be, depending on what I'm photographing. Now, it says on here, you can see, hopefully, there's this marker here saying best handheld. That basically means that anything faster than 1/125th of a second, you should be able to hold the camera yourself without using a tripod and get a sharp shot. Now, if your subject is really moving quickly, for example, when I photograph basketball, it's a very fast-paced game, I tend to find that I photograph at 1,000th of a second or faster. But because basketball's indoors, there's less light to come into the sensor than if you're photographing a football match outside. So you need to bear that in mind. So there's always a compromise there. But if you're photographing someone that stood still, you could photograph at 1/125th of a second. I wouldn't really go any slower than that. Sometimes I can get away with sharp images at sort of 100th of a second or less, or even as low as 1/50th if I'm really, really careful. But it starts getting really tricky then. So I would personally, when I'm photographing at weddings, my rule I have is I won't photograph at less than 200th of a second. That's the slowest I will photograph, because I'd hate to be photographing a bride walking down the aisle or people dancing or whatever it might be, and think I've got a brilliant moment, but actually look back and it's blurry, because I just never want to put a blurry image to a paying client. So that, I think, for me is the sort of the overall thing on shutter speed. It's the sort of base thing to look at. Have a practice with it. You'll find what you're comfortable shooting at. You might want to do a little bit of a test, take photographs of the dog running up and down the garden and see what shutter speed you need to be at to get those images sharp and in focus. Try some portrait shots of someone standing still and see how low you can drop that shutter speed to get sharp images. It's just one of those things you need to play with. I have a rule of 200th, but I will go lower if my subjects aren't moving. And I think you guys, if you follow that, you won't go far wrong. But if you're photographing anything like sport or, dogs jumping up in the air, for example, you're going to need to be at least 1,000th of a second. Cameras, by the way, they go up to, most of the modern SLRs will go to 8,000th of a second is the fastest. That tends to be a bit of an industry standard, but they will stop all the way down to 30 seconds, for example, I think, in some cameras. So you can have them open forever and photograph the stars moving around in the sky and that sort of thing on a tripod if you really want to. But I think for most of what you're going to need, it's going to be 200 plus. This slide you can obviously review. I think I've gone through it anyway, but the compromises you're going to get, obviously, if you have a slower shutter speed, you're going to compromise in sharpness. If you have a higher shutter speed, you're going to compromise in the amount of light coming through. So we'll come back to this shortly, because this all links up with the next couple of bits as well. But I'll just give you some examples of images. These are ones I've taken over the years to show you different shutter speeds at work. First of all, we've got a woodpecker in Florida, which, knowing how fast their heads move when they're pecking wood, and you can see the little bits of bark that are flying off, to get him frozen, I had to go to 4,000th of a second on a very long lens, and that was needed. Then the next one was taken on a basketball match in an arena where there was some light, but it wasn't as bright as outdoors. I knew I needed 1,000th of a second to capture the speed of the players. So I had to drop my aperture down to 2.5, and the ISO had to push it up to 3200 because, as I say, there wasn't an abundance of bright light. Big difference in the amount of light in this photograph of the basketball player and this one with a woodpecker in full sun. You can see my ISO here was a lot lower at 800. I know I'm sort of rushing ahead. I am going to explain ISO and I am going to explain aperture, but all of these example images I'm going to put in front of you for each of these three, it's important that you sort of understand what these numbers mean. So the first one is the length of the focal length of the lens that I use for the photo. So 500mm is a very long lens. That was one that I borrowed off a nature photographer to get close to my subjects. 85mm lens for the next one is a sort of a longish prime lens. Then again, I've got one at a wedding down here, which is shot on an 85mm lens, and then the one on the right is 35. The next number is your shutter speed, and I've highlighted that in yellow because that's what we're actually talking about. The F numbers are the aperture, so I think we touched on that briefly last week. So your f-stop, your f number, and aperture all means the same thing. The lower the f-stop, the more background blur, and the higher the f-stop, the more front to back sharpness is going to be. The bottom one is obviously ISO, which I'm going to explain a bit more shortly. So just moving through these again, I've got a shutter speed here of 200th of a second. The reason that is a 200th of a second is that is my flash sync speed. So I am lighting this moment with a flash gun, which, looking at the way he's lit, would have been over here somewhere, probably quite a bit further back, so I was on a long lens. So the light is hitting him here, which is why his face is lit here. And those flashes, when they're used off camera, can only be synced to a maximum speed of 200th of a second. That is as fast as the shutter can open and close in the time that the flash can resync itself, basically. So most of my flash stuff at weddings is at 200th of a second. The last one is an example of some fireworks. I actually shot this at 10th of a second, so it wasn't quite as slow as I thought, but you can have fireworks shots at a full second or something around that. But what I've done here is I've tried to freeze the couple. I've put a bit of light on the couple. I think I've got a flash firing at them to sort of freeze them just in case they moved, because at 1/10 of a second, that being handheld would be blurry, so it's on a tripod, and it just gives enough time for the fireworks to do their thing. But again, you'll notice that very low ISO, 3200, or very high ISO rather, and a very low aperture at 1.4 to try and let as much light as possible into the frame. Okay, that's shutter speed. So moving on, aperture and f-stops. So just to recap on this, guys, aperture and f-stops is the same thing. It's just two different bits of terminology for the same thing. For the exposure triangle, we'll tend to use the term aperture. On the cameras, as I will discuss shortly, when we look at the actual features on a camera, on a camera it will refer to as aperture priority, which is one of the semi-manual modes or semi-automatic modes that we'll cover. So I will probably refer to it as aperture for now, but it basically means f-stops. So this little diagram here that I grabbed off the internet basically shows you that the aperture is the more the aperture of the lens opens. So if you see this example here at f2.8, that opens more, that lets more light in. So that has the same effect as having the shutter open for a longer period of time. It lets more light to hit the sensor. So as you stop the lens down, which is the terminology we use for this, if you stop it down to f4, that aperture becomes smaller. Stop it down to f5.6, smaller still, and so on and so on. Most cameras will go up to f/22. That is the smallest or the highest aperture that you can access. Some cameras have f/32 as well. Some of the high-end SLRs, but very rare you'd need to shoot at f/32. The other end of the spectrum, depending on the lenses you have, your lenses will limit you to how low you can go with these. Some of you with SLRs at the moment will have lenses that maybe only go down to f4 or f5.6. As you spend more on your lenses and you invest in them more, you'll get lenses that maybe go down to f2.8, maybe even lower. I think some of you guys already have the 50mm f1.8 lens for your cameras, which is a recommended good lens for portraits. And if you've got that, that goes down to f1.8. You'd notice with that you get a nice blurry background. So this is one of the things with aperture. So as you're letting more light in, by having it at a lower number, you are also then blurring the background. Now that is called depth of field. So you have less depth of field with a lower f number and more depth of field with a higher f number. So for example, as we'll show you on the next slide, examples of this would be, actually, I'll come back to that one in a second. I'll show you these first of all, just to show you actual examples. So again, I'm highlighting in yellow the aperture numbers used in these photos. And you can hopefully see in the first one, a shot I did for a videographer friend, giving some profile photos. I've just focused on the lens of his camera and I've stopped the camera right down to f1.4 because I have my 35mm 1.4 lens, which is probably my favorite lens. And it's really blurred everything. I mean, even his hands and his fingers are slightly blurry, but you can see the level of the blur extending through to him in the background. So it really separates what we're trying to focus the eye on, which is here, from him behind. But it's still telling a story because it's basically saying there's a man here and he's either a photographer or a videographer. And what I want you to see and focus on is his camera. So you're sort of telling a story by blurring the background. If I shot that at f8 or f9, then chances are pretty much most of this would all be in focus, depending on how close I got to him. So you'd end up with less of a story. It would just be a photograph of a guy with his head cropped off. So I think by using the aperture and stopping it right down, it really separates the camera from the person behind. Over here in London, I took some photos of some phone boxes. And again, f2.2, I wanted to blur the ones behind and really draw the attention to this one here in the foreground. Again, I had good light, so I was able to shoot at a low ISO, 100 in this case, same as over here, with a reasonable shutter speed on a fairly long lens. Down here, I wanted every bit of the London eye to be sharp. And I also was quite happy for there to be some detail in the sky. So if I'd have shot this at f2, f2.2, probably wouldn't have seen much detail in the sky, and it could be that this part of depending on where I focused, if I focused on these capsules here, these ones here might be a little bit blurry, but I wanted the whole thing to be sharp. I wanted it to have really good optimal quality. So I've gone with f6.3. Again, I've got good light, so ISO 100, and the shutter speed is just what it needs to be to make that work. And over here, you'll see again, I've wanted, because there's some depth of field required here from this point to this point, I wanted it all to be really sharp. So I've gone with f8, and it's shot pretty much a few minutes after I took this photo. So the lighting conditions are very similar. You'll see that I've gone with ISO 100 on both, which, as I'll explain shortly, gives you the best quality image if you have a lower ISO number. But you'll see, because I've gone slightly higher on the f number here on f8, the shutter speed is ever so slightly lower at 160 to compensate and balance. So slightly higher shutter speed here, slightly lower aperture, slightly higher aperture here, slightly lower shutter speed. Now I'm going to tab it back to this one again, just so you can see. So this is not essential for you to learn and remember, but it's kind of helpful as you kind of progress with your photography. So again, what we've got here, we've got the wider aperture, everything open, lower f-stop number, the aperture closed up here with a higher f-stop number. Now you've got what can be described as a full light stop, would be between f1, which is very rare you get any lenses. There are f1 lenses, I don't have any. But between f1 and f4 is one stop. And between f1, 1.4 and f2 is one stop. And again, between 2, 2.8, 2.8 and 4, 4, 5.6, 5.6 and 8. Within that, you've got half stops. So you've got 1.2 would be a half stop, 1.7, 2.4, 3.3. But what you won't generally get those numbers on a lens. Most of the lenses that I've seen, you'll generally be working on third stops. So a third of a stop is definitely where you would be able to adjust your aperture by a third of a stop. And most cameras and lenses will give you this range between. So for those of you who are with lenses that only go down to f5.6, then you will see if you play with your camera, you can get an f-stop of 5.6, 6.3, 7.1, or 8. And if it goes down to f.4, you'll also get 5, 4.5, and 4. So if you ever hear the expressions a third of a stop, that means it's basically one more click round on the aperture wheel. The full stop is obviously 3 of these third stops. But again, this just demonstrates the depth of field you get with a narrower aperture as opposed to more depth of field with a higher one. More light coming through at this end, less light coming through at this end. And just, I'm not really sure what the sweet spot bit means, to be honest, so disregard that for now.
Can I ask you a quick question, Rafe?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, what do those numbers actually measure? Is it the area of the lens that's left open?
I don't believe it's a actual measurement in terms of length, because the lens's apertures vary in size depending on the lens. It's just a measurement in itself. The f-stop is a measurement in itself, basically. There's probably a lot more maths behind why the numbers fall the way they do. I'm not going to.
That's what I'm trying to figure out. I can't grasp the logical progression between 1.4, and 2, for example.
There is probably some maths behind it that I didn't want to bamboozle you guys with, but your camera will only give you the options of selecting these numbers here, the third of a stop thing. So you're not going to be in a position where you're searching for an aperture and you go accidentally to 2.3, because there won't be an option. It will either be 2.2, 2.2, 2.5, and so on. But the main thing to know is that you're going up in the same increment as if you go from 7.1 to 8, as if you go from 1.6 to 1.8. And I can't explain to you why, but when you start playing with manual mode or aperture priority mode, you are changing the aperture, you will just get used to these numbers and you'll have an idea of what they're going to do to your image. And that, again, it's very much a trial and error thing. It's just a case of being brave and playing with your aperture and just experimenting and seeing, what difference is it when I photograph my dog at f8 or f2.8, and you'll see on a longer lens particularly it makes a big difference. But one thing to bear in mind, in addition to what I've said, is your proximity to your subject is going to impact the blur. If I was to photograph a dog with a hedge behind him from 100 yards away with a long lens, at f2.8, there isn't going to be much separation. If the dog is close to the hedge, there's not going to be much blur between the dog and the hedge. But if I walk up to the dog and I'm really close to the dog and I photograph at 2.8, then that is going to blur the hedge behind. So you need to think about your distance from your subject. That's why when you photograph in landscapes, you may as well always go to a highish f-stop. You don't need to go to f22 or anything like that. But with a landscape, you're generally photographing something that's a long way away. So most of it is going to be sharp. You're not going to be in a position where you photograph some hills and the hills behind those hills are blurred out because they're miles away. So everything is going to be relatively sharp, even if you shoot at f2.8, for example. But I'm very conscious of the fact that the more technical I get, the more people I'm going to potentially lose. So I'm going to refrain from going into any more detail on that.
That's cool. Thank you.
That's all right, no worries. So ISO. Now this is probably something that if you've never come out of auto mode, you've probably not really had to deal with ISO. It's something that when you shoot in auto mode, the camera just decides what this is going to be for you, and it will generally make a number of assumptions, which is why I don't like shooting in auto and why I'm trying to get you guys out of auto. Is the camera will make all kinds of assumptions on what you want, and it won't necessarily assume the right thing. So with ISO, I always encourage my students to take manual control over it. The ISO is something that you need to basically be aware of because it does impact the image quality. In theory, the lower the ISO, the cleaner the image. And you can see with this split image here between what might be the Empire State Building, I don't know. But you can see on the left, it's shot at ISO 100 and on the right, ISO 3200. Now this deterioration of image quality, what we call that is grain. It's basically burnt out pixels because when you put your camera through a higher ISO, it uses more heat or produces more heat. And when it produces the digital image, some of the pixels will get actually burned, and this is the impact you have on it. It's basically called noise or grain. You can call it either. Now, ideally, you really want to minimize noise because you can see how that lowers the quality of the image. So you might think to yourself, if you didn't know this, you'd think, well, understanding the exposure triangle, if I want to shoot at a high shutter speed, everything, and I want good front to back depth of field quality, then I'm just going to shoot everything at a high ISO because that will give me the flexibility. But there is a compromise, and that is if you are shooting at higher ISOs, the image quality does deteriorate. Let me just see. I can't see my face, which makes me wonder whether I'm visible. Can someone just unmute and just tell me if everything's okay? Because I just can't see myself, which is slightly worrying. You guys see the screen and can you hear me?
Can't see you, but we can see the screen.
See the screen.
You can't see me?
No.
Yeah.
That's all right. No, great.
Can't see you. Yeah.
I'll turn myself back on when you need to see me, as long as you can see the screen. All right. Thanks, guys. Thank you. So now this is where, again, as you progress and you get better cameras, a more expensive camera will give you better performance at higher ISOs. The cameras I use, I have to take photos at ISO 3200, ISO 6400 sometimes at weddings when I can't rely on flash. So church ceremonies is one. In barns for ceremonies, I won't fire flash during a ceremony. So I need to get the cleanest images possible. And although there's so much you can do in editing afterwards, it's very difficult to polish a noisy image up to make it look like it was shot at ISO 100. You really can't do it without compromising in some other way and losing the colors or other bits and bobs. So it is a juggling act. You need to be very aware of your ISO. You don't want it unnecessarily high, but you are going to want to have it high enough that it gives you the settings you need, and predominantly the shutter speed that you need. And like we said earlier, if you're photographing something that's moving very, very quickly, then you want to make sure your shutter speed is high enough, and you might need to put your ISO up to enable you to do that, particularly if it's indoors. Remember the basketball photo I showed earlier, 1,000th of a second, f2.5, ISO 3200. So even though there was light in that sports stadium, it wasn't as bright as being outdoors, and I needed a high shutter speed, so I had to put my ISO right up. So just a few examples here, just to show that you're in daylight. So if it's a bright sunny day, I put my camera on ISO 100, and I know that that's going to give me the range that even if I'm shooting somebody in the shadows, I can stop the shutter speed down to maybe 200 of a second. It's still exposed to the shade on a bright day. If you come indoors or a shady day outdoors, you might want to have it at ISO 200 or 400. Flash indoors 400 to 800, darker indoors 800 to 1600, indoors at night 1600 to 3200 and so on. It is going to vary on your camera really a little bit. This is where the advances of a more expensive camera are going to have their benefits. I've just worked out to turn myself on again. I don't know how I turn myself off there. Anyway, it's more reassuring that I can see myself. It means things are working. Right, so I'm going to move on from this and show you some examples of ISO. Now, here's a bright sunny day. I chose a high shutter speed, 5 pounds per second, but f2.8 on a long lens, and I'm shooting at ISO 100 for the best optimal quality. This next image, I was taking photos of my boys and their cousin jumping off a wall, and I knew that they wouldn't necessarily all jump in an exact line. So if I'd have taken that photograph at, let's say, f2.8, then it's highly likely that one or two of them would have been slightly blurry. Whichever one my camera locked focus on would be sharp and the others would be slightly out of focus. So knowing I wanted them completely sharp, I went for a higher f-stop, which is 7.1 in this case, but I also needed a high shutter speed. So I went with 2000th of a second because, again, I didn't want any blur. Now, even though it was outdoors and there was a fair bit of light, because I pushed the camera to f7.1, and also I needed that shutter speed, it meant that I had to compromise a bit on ISO. So I had to put the ISO up to 1600 to get these settings to work for me. So this is probably the best example of this photo because, you know, like I said, if I'd have shot that at f2.8, I could have had the ISO at maybe 400 at the same shutter speed, 2000th of a second, and it just would have been the boys might not have been all totally in focus. And this is the sort of thing, I think this is a really good example of where you guys it'll be really good to challenge yourself and try and do something like this. It doesn't have to be 3 kids jumping off a wall, but, you know, don't just have 2 settings, ISO 100 and 3200, and never use in between. Try and work out the best compromise that, you know, you want the sharpness, you want the shutter speed to freeze everything, and what's the ISO that I need to give me that combination? Because the ISO really should be the final thing that you put into the puzzle to get the other settings to work. Because ISO 1600 on most modern SLRs is not going to give you an image that's too noisy or grainy. It's a perfectly fine image. There wasn't too much difference between shooting that at 1600 and 100, for example. The optical quality is almost as good. So it's all about compromise, balance, and juggling all three, which again, I'm going to cover shortly. So this one down here is the sun's already gone down, so there's not much light in the sky, but we've got this lovely, beautiful sky behind. It's a landscape shot, it's a fairly wide angle, 35mm lens. I've wanted it at f4. I could stop that lens down to f1.4, but I wanted a bit of detail in the sky, so I've gone with f4. I didn't want to push the ISO any faster, any higher than 3200, because it does start to deteriorate a little bit after that. And I've gone with my slowest shutter speed that I thought I was capable of holding. Because my subject's not moving, 100th of a second is fine. As long as you've got a steady hand, that's perfectly achievable. And I've got a sharp image at 100th of a second with reasonable detail in the backdrop still, without pushing the ISO any higher than 3200. So again, you know, this is another case. It's juggling all three things to get the outcome that I was looking for. This last one is just an example of really how high you can push the ISO on some cameras. Again, this is on my Canon R6. It's a photograph I took for a commercial job. Don't know if you recognize those people, bonus points if you do, but they're actually slibs in St. Paul's Cathedral, which is dark as a crypt, as big as an airport, and I needed to use a 300mm lens, which only stopped down as low as f4, so I couldn't go any lower. So an 80th of a second with a long lens is quite a challenge, but I was resting it on my sort of other arm as I was using it, and I had immense challenges in terms of technology that I had available to me to get a sharp image in such a dark room for a couple who were stood quite a long way away from me. So luckily my camera will perform at 12,800 ISO. If I zoom right in on that, and I can't because it's bedded into this presentation, you would see that it's probably not as nice a quality as these other images. It's a little bit grainy, but you get away with it. It's still usable. If it wasn't usable, I wouldn't have submitted it to the client. But given the circumstances I had there, that's about as low a shutter speed as I would go with handheld. I couldn't go any lower on the aperture, on the f-stop, and that was as high as I needed to push the ISO to get that exposure. So that's a very extreme example of when you might use a very, very high ISO. I hope that sort of makes sense, guys. Now I'm going to put it all together for you. Try to. So this is a very quick recap. And again, these slides I've put in here, some of them repeat. They kind of say the same thing, but everyone's brains work slightly differently. Some people find it easier to have text. Some people, like myself, for example, find it easier with diagrams. And I'm not a wordy person. I prefer to look at pictorial kind of explanations of things. So probably because I'm a photographer, but and not a solicitor. But here again, you can see at the top aperture, as we just recapping again. So smaller aperture, higher f-stop number, front to back sharpness, transitioning down to a wider aperture, letting more light in at this end with a lower f-stop and a blurrier background. Shutter speed, very simply, faster the shutter speed, thousandth of a second at this end, down to, I can't see behind my little window here, but that's probably 1 second. You've got sharpness, blur increasing, more and more blur. And finally, on the ISO, they've put, you can actually get ISO 50 on some cameras as well, by the way. I didn't mention that, but most of you will be limited to ISO 100. But you've got optical quality at this end with the lower ISO number, right through to very grainy, very noisy images at the extreme end. I think my camera actually, we'll dig it out in a minute. I think it goes to something bonkers like ISO 254,000 or something, but they would be pretty unusable images. Most cameras will go to at least 3200. If you've bought an SLR in the last couple of years, it will probably go beyond 3200. But if yours is a little bit older, I think Kev's on a 7D. I don't know what his goes to, but that might only be 3200 or 6400. Some of the earlier 5Ds are the same. But nowadays, even some of the budget cameras in the Canon and Nikon and Sony range will go, 12.8, 24.6. They'll really go really, really high. So again, if you prefer seeing actual photographs rather than sort of stick figure diagrams, we've got the same thing. So an example, f16, everything's sharp in the frame, stopping down, gradually getting more of a blurred background. F1.4, which is obviously the same as the one I took of the videographer. You've got a nice blurred background. And again, examples of if you happen to be photographing someone whacking a nail into a bit of wood, that's not going to be your homework project for next week, I promise you. But feel free to do it if you want. Thousandth of a second is what you're going to need to freeze that, and you can see at every other level, even at 250, if you're actually getting blur, and it depends how much blur you want as to how low you want your shutter speed. And again, ISO, you've just got the same photograph of a coin that deteriorates in quality the higher the ISO. So there's just different ways of getting the same message across, basically. Now, if you sort of put it into a triangle, I suppose this is where in the middle, in this bit here, is going to be your exposure. I've seen numerous ways of trying to illustrate the ISO, or the exposure triangle. Again, this is just one. There are other options, but fundamentally, it's understanding that the influence that changing one thing has on the exposure. So if you were to not touch your ISO or your shutter speed and you left them and you play around with your camera and you make the aperture higher, you go from f2.8 to f8. If you don't change either of these, you're going to get a darker image. If you go from f5.6 down to f2.8, you're going to get a brighter image. If you don't touch your aperture or your shutter speed on your camera, you leave those as they are, and you go to your ISO and you just change your ISO. If you change it from 100 to 800, that's going to give you a brighter image, and you'll see that in the back of your screen. Likewise, if you go from 800 to 100, it's going to get darker. And finally, if you don't touch your ISO and your aperture, and you just play with your shutter speed, if you go from a shutter speed of, let's say 125th of a second to 1,000th of a second, that's going to make the image darker. Now it's when you start juggling all three of these that's when you start to work out what is the exposure I want, but within that exposure, the correct exposure, do I want sharpness front to back, or do I want blur? Now, most of the time you're going to want, with the ISO, you're going to want to have a nice clean image without noise. In most cases, there aren't many cases you're going to deliberately want to put noise in. So you're going to want to keep your ISO as low as you can to get the optical quality. And then it's just a case of compromising your shutter speed and your aperture and balancing them out to get the desired look you're going for, whether it's intentional blur, freezing the frame, depth of field, or a lack of depth of field. Okay, so of all of the presentations that I'm going to deliver over the course of the 6 weeks, this is probably the one that you'll need to potentially revisit the most. I appreciate that some of you guys haven't yet invested in cameras where you can separate out the manual controls and do that. I think most of you can. Looking at what you've sent me you're using, I think probably 80 to 90% of you guys can control these manually and isolate them all. But for those of you who are maybe still progressing through point and shoot cameras or phones, when you get to the point where hopefully you will want to invest in a camera where you can isolate these and control them manually, this presentation is going to still be online for you. You can come back and review it and hopefully, just rewind it until it kind of goes in, or find someone else that's a better teacher. That's your other option. Okay, so moving on from that, just one more example. Again, it really repeats what the other one said, but again, it's just might be an easier way of explaining it. It's really whatever works for you and your brains. That's all I can say. For me, the only way you'll really understand this is to sit there with a camera in a room with reasonable light or outdoors and put it into manual mode and work out how you can change. First of all, work out how you can change your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter speed, so you know how to control those three things, and just play around and just experiment. I mean, it's the beauty of digital photography is you can take as many crap photos as you want, and you can just bin them all off at the end, and no one needs to see them. You're not going to waste loads of money on reels of film. You can just experiment, practice, and practice, and practice. But the key thing with all of this, guys, is that you really should have an intent before you take the photo of what you want this image to look like. And that is going to be based on the shutter speed and the depth of field. You need to have an idea, what am I trying to do here? What's the story I'm trying to tell with this image? Okay, great. I want a blurry background. So, okay, so I can put the shutter speed up a little bit if I want a blur background. I can have the ISO nice and low, and then think it through and then just execute it and do it at your own pace. Again, another third way of just explaining this for those that like a bit more of a wordy explanation. This is quite good in terms of these settings you see here that are in yellow, these combinations. So in this one, f8, 1/250th ISO 400. In this one, f4, 1/500th of a second ISO 200. And this one, f16, 30th of a second ISO 200. They will all give you exactly the same exposure. And by that, I mean that will let the same amount of light hit the sensor in your camera. So if you were in the same conditions and you were photographing, any object outside and the light didn't change, you changed your settings to all of these, you will end up with exactly the same amount of light hitting your sensor and the same darkness on the photo. They'll obviously look quite different because this one's at f4, so you're going to have more of a blurred background, and this one's f16, so it's going to be much more front to back sharpness. But basically, as you move, you can see if you were to start out on these, and you can experiment, this might be something to do in the next week, actually use these settings and just put this to the test. As long as you're in a place where the light is consistent, maybe a room with a light on that it's not going to suddenly get darker or lighter. Of course, if you do this outside and the sun's out and then the sun goes in, it's going to dramatically change what the output is. But if you can get consistent lighting somewhere, do this. Put your camera at f8, 2/50th of a second, ISO 400, take a photo. And then because you're knocking your aperture up 2 stops, remember what we talked about stops. These are 2 full stops. It would go from f8 to f4. You're then moving your shutter speed the other way 1 stop and your ISO the other way 1 stop as well. So that compensates for the 2 stops going that way. There's 1 stop here and 1 stop here. It's the same amount of stops. It leads to the same amount of light hitting the sensor. And again, you go the other way here. So we move the aperture up this way 2 stops. We move the shutter speed down 3 stops. And we move the ISO this way 1 stop. So we've got, again, a balance. We've got 3 stops on the shutter, 1 on the ISO in the opposite direction, and 2 on the aperture in the opposite direction. And it lets the same amount of light onto the sensor. You just end up with a different image. It's just going to look very different. Obviously, shutter speed of 1/30th of a second, you're probably going to need to be on a tripod anyway, unless you've got the world's steadiest hands. But I think, you know, a combination of this would be a really good way of practicing for you guys, is to just chuck these settings into your cameras and you'll see for yourself. And then you will see the impact of just moving those dials and what a difference it makes to your exposure. Right, I'm just going to take a swig of water because I'm losing my voice. Does anyone, very quickly, before we move on, I'll just check. I think yeah, so I'm moving on to camera setting modes. Is there anything, unmute your mics if you've got any specific questions to this part, and I'll spend 5 minutes going over them before we jump into the camera settings. Bloody hell, I explained that really well, didn't I? No questions. Okay, moving on before some of you change your mind. All right, so camera settings. Right, I'm just going to grab my camera out of the bag actually for this. So I need to show you I can. Now, I could spend the entire 6 weeks going through camera settings. What I'm not going to do on this course, because there's not enough time, and I think that you won't need it at this stage anyway, is I'm not going to walk you through the menu systems of every camera on the market to show you what every single thing does, because I'll be totally honest with you, I've been a professional photographer full-time for 6.5 years, and I probably only use 20% of what my camera does. There's so much on there you can do. I never use auto bracketing. There's loads of other features on this one I've got, which I don't even know what they mean. I'm one of these people that I'm not a big fan of reading instruction guides. I like to pick something up and just play with it and get it to do what I want by sort of trial and error. I don't feel that I need to know every single thing technical about photography to be a good photographer. Fundamentally, I'll be honest, I'm not a technical photographer. It's much easier for me to talk about the artistic composition and the lighting of an image than it is for me to explain this technical section of the course. And that's cards on the table, me being honest with you, is because I'm not somebody who obsesses about the features and functions of my camera. I have only learned what I need to learn to take the photos that you guys have already seen that I've taken. And to be honest, you could put me in any situation as a photographer and say, right, take a photograph of these Formula One cars whizzing past. And I think, right, okay, I need a monopod to stabilize it because I'm going to be panning and I'm probably going to go with the shutter speed of this. And even though it's not something I've ever done professionally, I could probably work out how to do it. But you know, there is so much detail that I could go into here. I've picked out what I think you need to know. So if there's anything not covered in this, you can ask me in the Q&A and I may or may not have an answer for you, but hopefully I'll be able to help. So first of all, we're going to look at shooting modes. Now, before we kick off, I'm going to tell you how I set my camera up. And if I need to revisit this at the end of this section, I will do, because I'm going to explain what a lot of this stuff on the left actually means. Obviously, I shoot in manual mode. You'd be interested to know, actually, that some of my friends who are actual professional wedding photographers actually shoot in AV mode or aperture priority mode, or whatever it's called on your system, which is where you basically you decide on the aperture and the shutter speed. The camera selects the shutter speed for you. And it gives you an exposure based on metering being the camera making an assessment of the image that you're about to take and how much light it thinks you need. Now, you don't need to meter. You don't need to worry about metering if you're shooting in manual mode, because you're doing the metering yourself. You're almost going, you know, finger in the sky, how light is it? Right, okay, this is how much light I'm going to let into the sensor. Metering is only relevant if you're not in manual mode. And I'm hopefully going to teach you guys to go into manual mode, because I don't think there's any benefit to teaching you shutter priority or aperture priority mode in the meantime. I was taught that. I was taught aperture priority when I was learning at the stage some of you guys are at. And I look back and I think that really hasn't benefited me. I spent a year faffing about in aperture priority mode, trusting the camera with shutter speeds that it would inevitably get wrong half the time and leave me with an image that you know wasn't fit for purpose. When I started controlling the aperture and the shutter speed was when my photography started really, you know, pushing on, because I was controlling it. Being a bit of a control freak, I suppose that was important to me, to be the one making all the decisions. I just never trusted the camera to get exactly what my brain wanted to get. So for that reason, all of these settings that you'll see on my camera are very much manually controlled. Even when I'm shooting with flashes, I manually control the power on them. I don't use TTL mode, which is like the auto mode for flashes. I control exactly what's going into them. So for me, manual mode, first and foremost, I use with the focus mode, and don't worry, we're going to come on to these bits in a minute, but the focus mode I use is Al Servo focus mode, which I will touch on, which basically means that if the subject's running to and fro all over the place, the camera will lock focus on them as they're moving to and fro towards you. So for moving subjects, it's essential. High speed continuous, which means I can burst images very, very quickly. It's not sort of one click and then you've got to release. If I hold the button down, it just goes and it just takes loads. My focus points I control manually. On this camera, you've got a very, very high quality touchscreen at the back. So when that's switched on, you can move it around like, you know, on a phone, and it will move the focus point to where your thumb is on the screen. It's also got a little joystick there as well, which is the backup, which sometimes I use, but because I've been on mirrorless cameras for a while, I tend to find the touchscreen is preferable for me. And I set if any of you have got cameras like this or are thinking of getting them, if you ever do, if you set the tracking area for your focusing to the top right corner of the screen, you'll find that when you put your eye to the viewfinder, your thumb will automatically fall in this section. Otherwise, if you've got to move it around over the whole screen, you have to take your face away from the camera to get the focus point down here. But if you set it to this corner here, it's exactly where your thumb kind of falls on the camera, which is absolutely perfect. So that's the focus point control. Back button focus, I'm going to talk to you about that. I don't know if any of you have heard of back button focus, but for me, it was a game changer when I started doing that in 2015, I think. That basically means you don't control your focus with the shutter button. You separate the shutter button from the focus button. So I'll talk you through that. I've got a slide on that coming up. Auto white balance. If any of you sort of wondered about white balance, I shoot in auto white balance. I've tried shooting with a manual setting and I forget to change it, and I end up then going indoors and photographing things and them all being bright orange because I've left it on a sort of a very warm setting for outdoors. I find that I can change the white balance in editing afterwards in Lightroom, so I can make something warmer or cooler very, very easily because I'm shooting raw files. That's one thing I forgot to put in here actually. I photograph raw files. If you guys are going to progress with your photography and do more editing and start pulling them into Photoshop and Lightroom, you'll be much better photographing raw files and just editing the raw files you want to keep. I'm going to do a little bit on workflow later in the course. I'll walk you through how I do that, how I take a raw file, how I convert it to a JPEG in software, export it, and everything else. So I'll cover that towards the end of the course. And then finally, the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. So all of the ingredients in the exposure triangle, I control through the dials on the camera. Again, fortunately on this camera, it's blessed with a click wheel here, which is my ISO, my shutter speed on this dial here, which is where my sort of my forefinger falls, and I can change that. And my thumb can move between the focusing here, the ISO here, and this click wheel here, this one here, which is my aperture. So I don't need to lift my head up from the camera to change any of those things. So I can be looking at a scene thinking, oh God, that's a little bit too bright. And I influence that by either my shutter speed, my ISO, or my aperture, depending on where I put my finger or my thumb at the time, without having to take my head away from the camera. Now, all of these settings, please do not think you have to replicate these. I work in a very high pressure environment where there's no room for error and there's no tolerance for blurry images or missed moments. I have to be able to deliver, and I can't blame it on my camera and say, oh, well, my camera decided to expose it differently, or it gave me a shutter speed that was too slow. So sorry, I didn't get you cavorting through the garden on a space hopper, Mrs. Bride. It's the camera's fault, not mine. I've got to be on top of all that. So I've set the camera up to be incredibly responsive, to be really manually controlled, and I know where everything is and I can access it really, really quickly. For you guys, you will not need to be quite as extreme. You know, you have to make a decision on how you set your cameras up. I think I'm going to get you guys to take more control. I think that's the whole point of this course. But how much you take is up to you. You might find it to do it in stages. You might want to get your head around manual mode and then come back and do back button focus in a few months. It's entirely up to you. Anywho, moving on. So, camera shooting modes. Most of the dials, I've made, you know, assumptions. I mean, looking at what you guys are shooting, it was quite interesting for me. I think only 2 of you are Nikon shooters. I think 8 of you are Canon, and I think 4 or 5 of you are Sony, and then there's someone's Panasonic, and there's a couple of others as well added in as well. But the majority are Canon, lots of Sony shooters, not so many Nikon. But these are basically what your dials look like on most of these cameras. The terminology is very slightly different, but the actual what they all do is very similar. Now, on my camera, which if I tab back, you'll notice that you see all these are called scene selection options here, which I'm sure some of you will have played with. So you've got nature one here, you've got, I think that's a sport one, that looks like a landscape one, that's portraiture, and that one's flash disable. So you've got the Canon equivalent on here and some of the Sonys as well. But if you're shooting with a high-end pro camera, you don't get those. All I've got on here is P mode, FV, which oh God, someone told me what that meant the other day. That's a new thing that's come up on this mirrorless. I can't remember what it stands for. TV, which is shutter priority, AV, which is aperture priority, M, which is manual, B, which is bulb, and then C1, C2, and C3 are basically custom modes that you can set up within camera. So I can click on one of those and it'll bring me to settings for a church, for example. And then you've got the video mode here as well. So on a pro camera, that's basically what you get. You don't get the option of having flower mode or anything else. Now, I want you guys to start to disregard all this, because it doesn't mean if you put it on tulip mode, you're going to get an epic nature shot. You've got to be the one making the decisions on what that image looks like. And that is why we're going to try and get you guys to shoot in M mode, which is manual. Hopefully we're not going to have so much of the green square of the auto. I'm not going to go into these in detail because, you know, like I said, I could really confuse you guys by talking about shutter priority and aperture priority. But very, very quickly, aperture priority is when you control the aperture, but the camera decides on your shutter speed. And shutter priority or TV mode is the opposite. So you're deciding on the shutter speed and the camera will decide on the aperture. There aren't many situations you'd probably shoot shutter priority unless the whole point of the image is around shutter speed, but then I wouldn't want the camera dictating the aperture for me. It would just feel really weird. So I can't really see the benefit of it, and I don't think I've ever used it, to be honest. But aperture priority is a bit like putting stabilizers on your bike when you come out of auto mode. It means you're not controlling the shutter speed, but it does mean that you're at least controlling the depth of field. So as a stepping stone towards going into manual, it's something you can have a play with. You would be able to either have it on auto ISO, if that was your option, let the camera decide on the ISO, or you can manually select the ISO and just let the camera worry about the shutter speed. That is something I will leave up to you to decide. It's entirely your choice, but it is a little bit of a sort of way of hopping from the murky depths of auto to the brave new world of manual. These are, I won't go through all of these because we don't really want to focus on them too much. But again, I think this is based on, this will be Canon, I think, but looking at it. think that's Canon. Yes, I think that's Canon. So this is what some of you guys with Canons are going to be looking at already. I'm sure you know what these mean, but if you don't, you can use them as reference. But your homework is to not use any of them again, other than obviously aperture priority, fine if you want the stabilizers on. If not, metered manual is what we want you guys to be using. Okay, focus modes. This is probably fairly obvious. I'm sure you know this already, but manual focus is when you have the option of that on your camera. It's fairly easy to activate. Is when you're focusing with a focus ring. So again, on this camera here, you would use the focus ring here to manually focus rather than autofocus on one of the buttons. There are very few times when I think that I can do a better job of manually focusing than the autofocus on my camera. I trying to think of an example actually. In my commercial work, probably not at all. I just find that what you think is sharp when you're looking through the viewfinder isn't always sharp, and you'll get the image back and you go, oh, it's just a little bit too blurry still. I trust my autofocus. I've set my autofocus up so that it's reliable and I know what it's going to do. And I think for you guys, the best thing you can do is master your autofocus. It might seem slightly odd that I'm here trying to teach you guys how to shoot in manual modes and take control, but the one thing that I do recommend you don't outsource is your focusing to yourself. I would keep that within the camera. Cameras these days, even phones, my iPhone 11 Pro is a hell of a camera. I mean, it takes better images than some of my first SLR images in terms of optical quality and in terms of how you can use it. It just limits you in terms of being able to take sort of longer length shots. Fundamentally, it's just a very wide angle tool. But autofocus, really, I'm a big believer in. The camera knows how to get it sharp better than your eyes do. So for the sake of this course, leave your cameras in autofocus unless you are finding, I mean, astrophotography is the one example. I think you have to go manual because the camera, if you point at the sky, it's just not going to be able to lock in on anything. You almost need to set that up yourself. But other than that, I can't really think of many examples. Even with macro photography, if I'm photographing things like flowers or insects, I still use autofocus because it will still lock better than, or more accurately than I will. So autofocus is the way, folks. Now, I'm going to quickly rattle through these as quick as I can. So there are autofocus modes, and there are fundamentally three, and they have slightly different terminology based on your camera system. The first one is either called one shot in Canon, or AFS in Nikon, or single shot AF in Sony. And basically that is for photographing a static object. So if you're photographing something that you know is not going to suddenly move backwards or forwards, or a landscape, for example, you can have it in single AF, single shot AF mode, or one shot, or whatever you want. It's just going to lock focus, and that depth of focus isn't going to change. You can hold that focus button down, and if the subject moves though, then you're then not going to be in focus still. The camera is not going to adjust the focus forwards and backwards to allow for that subject moving. So for that reason, I never use it because I can't see the point, because what I do use is L servo mode or continuous AF in Sony or AFC in Nikon, because I'd rather have the flexibility of knowing that my focus is going to move if my subject moves, because sometimes I might be photographing a building for a job that isn't moving, or even a landscape within a wedding. But within a few seconds of that, I could be photographing a kid running at me on the lawn. And I can't be thinking about changing my focus mode back from single AF or one shot to L servo. So for me, there is no disadvantage in having it permanently in L servo. Now, again, I say this with a bit of a but, because it will depend on how good your camera is at focusing. Again, I have to have the very best kit, and I have to have a camera that is going to nail focus with 95% accuracy. So there is a difference in the focusing abilities of the top end cameras from your entry level SLR. So that is something to bear in mind. If you're finding that L servo isn't working for you, it's hunting or it's missing focus, and you just want to photograph static objects, then go to single shot or one shot or whatever it's called on your system, and go back and just do that. But understand, if you do then go to a moving subject, then it could be difficult if they're moving around and you're trying to get focus on them. Again, another thing that links to the focusing is your lenses. So lenses have built within them a ability to focus quickly or slowly. Those of you who've got the 50mm f1.8 lens, particularly, I don't know what the Nikon one performs like, but I know on the Canon, I used to have it back in the day. And although it takes lovely, beautiful portraits with blur behind, because you can stop it down to f1.8, the focus on it moves with about the same speed as continental drift. I mean, it's painful. So there's no way you're going to be able to photograph a dog running around the garden at f1.8 and get that locked on him, even on a decent camera. The lens just goes like that, and it is really painful. So a more expensive lens has, for example, the Canon lenses. I think you probably won't be able to see on this one, but it says on there, ultrasonic. So anything with USM on it, a Canon lens with USM or ultrasonic motor, it's got the ability to focus very, very quickly. So it literally is just like dig, 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 like that. It's instant. So for photographing fast moving things, you are going to be limited a little bit by your lens. So again, some of the cheaper kit lenses with the cameras, so the sort of standard issue 18 to 55mm Canon zoom lens that some of you guys are working with, you will reach the limit of that lens's ability if you're trying to photograph something that's whizzing around the garden really quickly, or cars going around a racetrack, or horses running past. There's a reason why good lenses are expensive, and that is fundamentally one of the big reasons why they're focusing. And that is what you're paying for. You're paying for a lot of technology in that lens, a lot of glass, the ability to stop that lens down to something like f2 or f1.8, the ability for that lens to focus really, really quickly. So it's a bit of a combination of getting a camera that can do the job, but also you need to have the right lens on it. Because if I put the nifty 50, as I call it, the 51.8 on this camera is not going to make up for the fact that that's a £90 lens. It's not going to compensate for it. So I'm going to end up with very slow focusing and lots of frustration and lots of missed images. So I think there's a bit more text there as well that you guys, I've left that in there for you to sort of come back to if you want me, a bit of a refresher on it. But single shot, whatever you want to call it, one shot. If your subject is still, yep, fine. If it's moving around, continuous AF. Now, there is a third and final version, which again, I never personally use, but I've put it in here because it exists, and that's our Focus, which is the same on Sony continuous AF. That must mean Sony don't have it, I guess. But on Nikon, it's AF-A mode. So it's like a hybrid mode, and it's supposed to be a sort of an intelligent compromise. But it basically says that it kind of uses its own intelligence to recognize that if your subject has been running around and then it stops, that it will then go to single AF for you. But again, I can't really understand why you'd need that, because I don't have any problem with our servo. So if I'm photographing kids who are running around in a wedding reception, and one of them stops, my camera's still going to get it in focus anyway. So having never used it, I can't really say what the benefit is, but it exists. So if some of you want to experiment with that and see, then be my guest, give it a play. I think it's this next week is going to be a good week for playing around, for those of you that have got the luxury of time to do so, and have a play with the focus modes and see, and report back to me in next week's Q&A, and you can let me know if any of you try our Focus, and if you find it's actually better, I'd genuinely be interested to know, because I can work that into future training, and if it's got an advantage and you guys think it's worth looking at, then that would be really good to know. Okay, moving on. So this is a bit of a summary. It gives examples. Again, it's just another way of presenting the same information of examples where you might use single shot, one shot, landscape, still portraits, architecture, continual focus or El Servo, wildlife, sports and action, and the hybrid autofocus, wildlife, children, street events, street photography and events. So that's another way of explaining it for you all. Right, so this, again, I'll try and run through this fairly quickly. I'm conscious of the fact that I'm already over an hour, so apologies for that, but I do want to try and get this finished today if I can. So these are your focal point selection area or area modes, focus area modes, depends how you want to describe it. You may have seen these in your options already, but ultimately you need to be, as an improving photographer, in control of what you want in focus. Now, if you're using shallow depth of field, it's even more important that you have that focus point where you want it. For example, the eyes of your subject, if it's a person or a pet. Less important if it's a landscape miles away in the horizon, because most of it's going to be sharp anyway. But this gives you a bit of an explanation. So a single point, as it were, means you can really isolate that point. For example, to eyes. So if you're photographing a face very close up, it's very easy. Again, if you're shooting at something like f2.8 or below with a portrait lens, you'll notice that if you don't control that focus to the eye, it will quite often focus on the nose, because the nose is slightly closer to the my girlfriend's just bought me a large whiskey in, which is just a tonic. I'll just finish might finish my voice off completely. The nose quite often accidentally picks up the focus, particularly if you're like me and you've got a huge nose, then it meets the focus before the eye. So again, that's where when I'm doing portraiture, I will always put the focus on the eye, and the closer you are to the subject, the more risk you've got of that focus going elsewhere, ears, mouth, something else you don't want in focus. So that's where you would use single point, I think, is the best example. If you are photographing a situation where there's wildlife and sports and your subjects, maybe there's multiple subjects and they're running around, you're photographing your kids playing rugby or something, then you might want to go for dynamic area mode, where the camera makes some assumptions based on what's happening in the scene, and it will try and give you a real spread of focus points around where the action is. If you want to open up all your focus points, you can go with sort of an auto area mode, which again gives more control to the camera. But you might find that it just makes the wrong decisions for you at the key moments. So I think for me, the first two, I think for what we're trying to do with your photography, are probably where I try and focus. I think if you flick between those two, so that you've got something that is weighted more towards the center, but the focus points around it are also reading as well, or you take complete manual control over a single point focus, and you can move that around by whichever option you want on your camera. Some of you might have joysticks to do it with, others might have touch screens, etc. Finally, at the bottom, eye autofocus. Some cameras have this on there. It's becoming more common. It's starting to filter down from the pro models down to the sort of consumer model SLRs now. It used to be a real luxury sort of 3-4 years ago. Sony bought it out on their top end SLRs, and it was the wedding photography industry got very excited about it, because suddenly you could just guarantee pin sharp eyes in all your photos. Canon came onto it a little bit later. As often is the case, Sony come up with the tech first, and then Canon catch up a year or two later and then do it better. But Sony, to be fair, seemed to be always ahead of the tech game and releasing things first. The IAF, or the eye autofocus on my camera, is the best I've ever seen. It's absolutely killer, and it won't even focus on the eyelashes or the eyebrows. It will go right in on the pupils. It's so accurate, it's scary. So I can have someone walking at me fairly quickly, cameras in our servo mode, high-speed continuous, and I'm just using the button that I've assigned for eye autofocus, holding it down, holding my focus button, and I'm just shooting, and it's just, no matter what happens in that scene, the focus stays right on the eye. It's a really bad way of describing it, but as it moves around, the focus point stays on the eye, and it's really, really good. And it means you can shoot at really shallow depths of field, not worry about having bits of the face off that you wouldn't want. If you've got IAF on your camera, if you're lucky enough to have it, have a play with it. You'd probably want to try and assign a button to use it. I've got a button right down here on my camera, which is, I think my little finger uses it actually. It's down on the bottom here. right here, and I use it with my little finger, so I'm sort of holding the camera like this. Actually, it's polarized. That finger there, and it's just there, and I can basically turn it on and off just by pushing it. But unless you've got a reasonably high-end model, you might not have that luxury yet. But I think it's going to probably start filtering down even more to cameras over the next couple of years. Right, so now I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, mainly because we're, as always, running slightly over in time, but also because I promised you I wouldn't go into aperture priority or metering. But if you are shooting outside of manual mode, it's good to have an understanding of metering. Metering is the camera trying to assess what the correct shutter speed and aperture should be. So those of you shooting in auto mode still, or even aperture priority, your camera is going to be metering when you half squeeze it. So as you probably know, most of you are probably using your shutter button as your metering button and your focusing button. So as you do a half squeeze on it, it will do a meter reading, and it will also lock focus. And then when you give it a full press, it will create the image basically. So with metering, depending on how you set your metering up, it will do different things. And you can set your metering up to be very precise. So if we go to the next page, I think. Wake up. PowerPoint. Leave me hanging. Hang on, probably my machine's doing an update. Just bear with me while I swig some water, not the whiskey. There we go. Right, okay. Again, the text is all there, guys, for you to read back in your leisure, but there's no benefit to me treating you like kids and just reading off a screen. Right, why have you changed the microphone? Why have you taken all of the screens off? Sorry, bear with me, guys. Zoom seems to have a nasty habit of making decisions for me, and as you know, I like control, and I'm not getting it at the moment. So why can't I see? No, I don't want that. That's not what I wanted. Okay. Moved my settings, which is not good. Why have they disappeared? Sorry, guys, bear with me. I've just done something I didn't want to do. There we go. Right, okay, I'm back on here. I can't see any of you, but I'm going to proceed anyway for now. Again, if things disappear, visual or audio, someone just shout or send me something on Messenger and I'll keep an eye on the phone. So the different types of metering, spot metering is quite a common one. Spot metering means that the center point is where all the metering is going to be done. Now, to give you an example of where spot metering would make a difference is if you were to take a photograph of a crow, let's say a crow, a blackbird, for example, with the sky behind it, it's bright white sky or blue sky, but it's bright behind. If you were to use spot metering and you were to put the point of the crosshair or in the middle of the camera through the viewfinder on the crow, it's going to read that as obviously being a very dark image because it's only going to be looking at the bit in the middle of the metering guide, the viewfinder rather. So it's going to go, oh, we've got a lot of dark here. We're going to want to we're going to need to add some light in here and we're going to need to expose it more. So it's going to give you an image based on the fact that it's a black bird and it's going to make it much, much brighter. If you've got your metering as sort of center weighted or evaluative and it's metering over the whole viewfinder and it's recognizing the sky around the blackbird as well, then it's going to go, well, actually, we've got a really bright background here as well. So we don't want to overexpose it because maybe they want some of that sky or cloud in the background to be exposed for. So it will give you a darker exposure. So it will let less light into the camera. So you'll end up with possibly having a faster shutter speed than you would if you were using spot metering and just focusing on the black feathers of a crow. So that's probably the best example of metering. is that here on these two, it's looking at more of the scene in general, and on these two, it's looking more at just the bit that you're focusing your point on. So your focus point is what it's going to meter for, and if that's on the crow, then that's the metering you're going to get. But if you've got it set so that you've got a more evaluative metering, then it's going to give you a more balanced exposure. So that's my layman's term expression of metering, even though it's something I never use anymore. Now, there is some confusion between metering modes and autofocus area modes. So I pulled this together to hopefully explain that they are very, very different things, because when you're going through the menu system, they do look quite similar. So for example, you can see single point autofocus and spot metering. It'd be easy to get confused between the two. You've got to remember that focusing is one thing, but metering is a completely different thing, although it's all happening in the same half button press. So you need to think about, if you are going to shoot outside of manual mode, how you want your metering to look. Do you want it to be evaluative, or do you want to be very much in control and say, if I'm photographing a dark object, I want the detail in the feathers on that crow. Because if you want the detail in the feathers on that crow, you've got to expose for those black feathers, which means you've got to let some light into them. If you want something that's going to, you're going to want to see the sky behind, that crow's going to be like a silhouette. You go with evaluative metering, because it's going to darken the image so that you can see the clouds behind. You're going to end up with a very, very silhouetted bird with no detail in the feathers. But just be aware of the terminology that you will encounter and that you will see through your menu systems on your cameras, because they do very different things, but they look very, very similar. Okay, back button focusing. This is, I think, the end. Yes, the last slide we got there. So back button focusing is, for me, essential in that it separates the pressing of the shutter from the focusing. Now, just in my camera, or most sort of top-end Canons, the best button I find to use is where your thumb falls. So what you need to try and do, if you want to embrace this, and again, it's definitely something to go away and practice, is that your thumb, or my thumb in my camera, and again, I don't even know if, let me see if I can get the, oh, look, I'm back again. I don't know why it keeps turning that off, but hopefully you can see me again now. So the way I hold my camera is, I've got my thumb here is doing most of the work. My thumb here, I don't know if you can see on here, is flicking between, it's changing the aperture on here, the ISO down here, but it's also using obviously the focus points on the screen here, or the joystick. But my thumb is also doing the focusing. So when it comes to taking the photograph, my thumb is on the AF on button, which I've actually put an example image on this screen here. You can see if you go into the custom control menu, you can change this button, which is your shutter button. So you can see that, that's the shutter. So for some of you, if you're not using back button focus at the moment, your shutter is doing your focusing, your metering if you're shooting outside of manual, and it's your shutter button. But for me, it is just a shutter button, because I'm shooting in manual, so I don't need metering. I do all the metering myself by setting my own settings. My focus is on this, and I control my focus by holding that down. And then once that locks, and I've got that held down, if my subject then moves, the focus stays with that subject. So I just keep my thumb pressed on AF on, and my subject will stay in focus, and I can recompose, move my camera around and get a different composition. And then I don't, and then but my subject is still going to be in focus, and then I can just shoot away as I please. And because I've got it on high-speed continuous and L servo and continuous focusing, that subject can go backwards, forwards, left, right, and my camera will just keep that focus locked on it. And if I decide I want to put them in the corner of the frame because I want to do rule of thirds or something, then I just adjust the composition and take the photo. And that is where, because what we're doing here is we're trying to give you guys more control. Back button focus will give you more control. If you put it into YouTube, you'll see 1,000 videos, probably better than this section of this presentation, that will show you how to do it. But pretty much every SLR, you will have this custom menu option here, depending on which one you're shooting with. and you will be able to set the AF on button if it's Canon. I think it'd probably be something else if it's on Nikon, possibly. I think this is a Nikon here, and it's the AF on, is that AF on? I'm not sure. It can be the auto exposure lock one, which is AE-L. That's a button you probably won't use much anyway, so just you can assign that to it as well. But I would really try and practice back button focusing if you can, guys. For those of you that can, have got the cameras to do it. I appreciate some of you guys haven't got SLRs, but for those that do, give it a go. Okay. I have an issue with tabbing left and right at the moment. Okay, let's try and bring you all back. Right, okay, once again, I'm back. So before we look at your images from last week, guys, and we have a quick Q&A, your homework for next week is I'd like you to send me 2 images. I'd like you to take one image of a fast shutter speed, something that needs a fast shutter speed, and I want to see evidence that you've managed to nail it. Ideally, if you can do that in manual mode, you get bonus points. If you trust the camera with auto, then it's a bit of a cop-out. But if you want to do it in aperture priority, but you're going to need to get your settings so that you know you're going to get a high shutter speed, or you could do it in shutter priority and let the camera decide what the aperture is. It's entirely up to you. But if you can get something in manual mode, a high shutter speed, I'd really like you to practice that. And I'd also like you to try and get some of the shallow depth of field. And I appreciate those of you who are still shooting with phones, or maybe kit lenses, and you don't have a long lens that stops down. That might be slightly tricky, but if you get really close to your subjects, you can still blur out the backgrounds at f4. So give me something where you would deliberately want to blur out the background. Give me an example of that. So just 2 images I'd like you to send me this week, guys. So that is the homework. So that's the presentation done. So I can stop the sharing now. Oh no, I need to share it. Sorry, I'm being an idiot because I need to get into Lightroom. So, right, so let me close that down. Sorry guys, my laptop seems to be really sluggish. Every time I press something on it, it seems to be turning off the screens. I'm going to have to investigate that next week. Oh, come on. Just want to escape. There we go. Right, I've escaped. All right, guys. So I am screen sharing. Great. That means you can see me. Thank you all for sending me some lovely images, by the way. There was some really good stuff coming through. If you can send it, ideally Sunday evening, worst case by lunchtime Monday. If they come through sort of late afternoon today, it just puts pressure on me a little bit to try and incorporate it into the presentation. Also, if you can send it to me as JPEG, a couple of you sent stuff as PNG files, which means I need to then convert them. And also, if you can just attach them to the emails, that makes it easier. Some of them were embedded within the email, and I had to forward it to a Hotmail account because it's the only way I could save the actual images. It was just a bit of faff, but it's not the end of the world. I can do it if needs be. Now, there's a load of images here. I'm not going to have time, especially at 9 o'clock, to go through them all, but I wanted to sort of pick a few, hopefully one from each person, and just you know, discuss them very briefly. So let me see. I think I'll leave it in this view. I'm assuming you can see all this. So I've got this example here of symmetry. So with this one, I appreciate the author may not have had the ability to edit afterwards, but you've obviously got, you know, a good balance of trees either side. There's a bit of a leading line there as well. But really, it's just a case of, if you're going to do symmetry, have someone like right dead in the middle of the frame. So, you know, if you were to crop this in camera at the time of shooting, and, you know, just by doing that, just makes it much more symmetrical immediately. So the brain just likes that so much more now that it's right in the middle. I liked this image here of the leading lines, which looks, trying to work out which church that is actually. I'm not sure. I thought it was St Mary's in Hitchin, but no, I don't think it is. But you've got the really good leading lines here, these two predominantly, but also you've got this line coming in here, so that's a really good spot. Takes your eye through the frame to the end here. So yes, that's really good stuff. This one I absolutely loved. This is just a gorgeous image. Absolutely stunning. Couldn't really have photographed that any better myself. Just really love the facial expression. And if I was to put my little grid up, we've kind of got the rule of thirds here. We've kind of got, although it's not on the eye, you've got the face is around the 2/3 here. So these 2 points here is where your eye's being drawn to. But, you know, that is brilliantly composed, beautifully blurred background, lovely sharpness on the eyes, just a really, really good portrait. On. So I've got this one here that I liked. So again, it's a really good leading lines one. There's just lines galore going in here. So many. You've got triangles everywhere here. I've never seen so many triangles in an image. It's just really well done. I would say that you could probably pull your highlights down a little bit. If we were editing this, the first thing I'd do is knock the highlights down a bit like that, just to pull a bit more detail out. Maybe pull a little bit out the shadows as well, possibly like that. But, you know, as an image taken, it's really, really good. I do think that on this one thing you could do, and again, it's been framed vertically in portrait, but you were to make that landscape, I think you'd still have the desired effect, or even maybe square, and you put the corners on like that, and maybe pull that up here. So what I've done here is now you've got the diagonals and the corners are starting right from the corner of the frame. So I think that makes it slightly stronger image now. I think that really draws the eye in a little bit more than before. So you can sort of see, before and after doesn't work because I've cropped it. But even so, really well seen. Got some gorgeous ones here. I think the one that sort of caught my eye the most was this one of Symmetry. Loads. So lovely, lovely reflection there. I mean, a gorgeous image anyway, lovely light, just really beautifully done. I mean, I'm not a big fan of portrait photos as a whole. I shoot 98% of my stuff in landscape, which is sort of horizontal mode. But I think this really works. I think obviously to get this to work in particular, it needed to be that way. But you've got the detail of the clouds in there, which is great. You've got the figure in there with lovely bright colors, which I think really draws the eye in. And it works really, really well. So absolutely stunning. I also really like this one as well. I thought the composition on this was really nice. Love the exposure, the fact these people are sort of silhouetted and you've got sort of silhouettes here, just really pleasant. The only thing it does is it breaks my rule of 50-50 horizon, but it's still a lovely image, so I'll kind of forgive it that. Okay, moving on. I really like this one. This one has a bit of symmetry, although this kind of spoils the symmetry a bit, but that's not the author's fault. But you've got lovely leading lines here. It's just really well lit, beautiful light on the building, exposed perfectly. It's not blown out. It looks absolutely spot on. But these really do lead your eye into, you know, the business part. And as I say, you know, that would be really symmetrical if that wasn't on there, but it's still a lovely image. I particularly like this one of Biggie Smalls as well, being reflected on a table or an iPad or something, just because it's Biggie Smalls really. And my OCD wants to sort of straighten it a tiny bit, maybe just pull that up just a smidge like that. But yeah, that's really cool. Okay, right, this one caught my eye. Symmetry on it as well. Very, very simple, but very effective. I think with this one, I would be tempted to probably underexpose it. It's a little bit bright. I mean, you can pull the highlights in a little bit on that, maybe bring it down. But I think on this one, I think because it's such a symmetrical image and all the shapes are interesting, I'd have this sharp. I'd have shot this at a higher f-stop and had this railing in front as sharp as the windows. I think it would have added to it more. I don't think there's a story being told by having this blurred. I think it's an architectural shot. And in architectural shots, we generally work at a higher f-stop because we want things to be sharp throughout the range of the photo, a bit like landscape photography. Occasionally, with a longer lens, we might want to blur something out if it's a particular feature of a building, which I do sometimes with my architectural photography, but most of the time I'm shooting everything front to back pretty sharp. Let's have a look. So we've got, I know where these are taken. These are definitely Purton photos. I lived there for 8 years. It's a recreation ground. I really like the simplicity of this one. Again, leading lines, going in here, another one here, another one here, and another one down here. Just really nicely balanced shot, to be honest. There's nothing in there that distracts the eye away from what you're looking at. It's just nice and balanced, good leading line. It's not trying to reinvent the wheel, but it's just a good, effective photograph. Okay, this one caught my eye. I think we've got rule of thirds executed to perfection there. The little man's head in his Spider-Man romper suit is absolutely bang on there. And it's a fun photo. And I think what I also like about this is that the author's not afraid to use dead space and have this large clear area here. I think that definitely adds to it. I would crop in a bit closer. I think you can still tell the story of this image by losing a bit of this grass maybe coming in. Let me just lock on here first of all. Don't worry, this is not the editing session, guys. We're going to do a bit more on this later. This is just a good way of me showing you the composition by being in Lightroom and being able to sort of crop them down. But I think you can still replicate all of the compositional goodness of this and just get the little dude a little bit closer to the camera. I don't think that loses anything, but it's nice to see a bit more of him. You've still got this out of focus area here, which works. But yeah, that was lovely. Moving on here, let's have a look. This one is really nice. This looks like Aughtonhead Common, actually. I wonder if it is. I know they've got some of these little bits going off into that down by the river. But again, really, really lovely tones. Obviously, frosty day, and the path leading off. That was the one that my eye was sort of drawn to the most. But yeah, very pleasing shot that. And just opening up this one here. Really like this one as well. I think this, I'm guessing the intention was sort of rule of thirds, and again, it does. Foreground interest, which I'm always happy with, which you got here, which is good. A little bit of blur, focuses the eye on this bit here, which is where the intersection on the third is. So good job on that one. You've got the exposure about right as well. Very easy with snow if you're shooting in auto mode to have it too dark, because the camera sees all the white, and if it's doing the exposure, it assumes that you want that to be gray. So if you've ever shot lots of photos on in an auto mode on any camera or on a phone in snow, and you've always thought they look a bit grey and a bit mucky, it's because you've got to basically tell the camera, no, that's snow and it's white, and I want to see it as white, not grey. This is a little bit grey, but I've seen a lot worse, so it's a pretty good job of rendering it still. Let me just see here. So I really like this one. I thought that the lighting was particularly good. You've got your exposures spot on here, in as much that the subject is perfectly exposed. But you've also got the detail out in the garden exposed as well. It's very easy to have the highlights blown through a window, but this is very well controlled. In terms of the rule of thirds, I'd probably bring it in slightly. I'd just do that. But other than that, perfect really. Some of this space can be lost, but I think for balance, it's good to have a space around the head. Remember, we talked about that last week, which you've done. So that's good. And just a really clean image. Really, really enjoyed looking at that one. Okay, we've got a bit of symmetry here on a reflection on a pond, which is done really nicely. If you're doing reflection stuff, a little hint. Now, Richard might not have wanted to have got completely covered in mud, and knowing his wife, she probably wouldn't thank me for it if he did. But if you get, the lower you get to your reflective surface, whether it's a mirror or an iPad or a glass table, or in this case, a pond, you will get a more clear reflection. So it will look more symmetrical if you can get nice and low. So in this case, perhaps Richard should have lied on his belly with his face almost in the pond in the sub-zero temperatures you probably took it in. Actually, probably not actually, because it's not icy. But you would get a slightly better reflection if you get a little bit lower with that one. But even so, it's a nice reflection. This one, I really liked this image. I thought just a really lovely exposure on it, just caught absolutely perfectly. But you've got symmetry in this one. You can see, just pull that in ever so slightly, get it bang in the middle there like that. But you've got some triangles coming in here as well. You've got leading lines as well as your symmetry. So my brain saw that and immediately just thought, I like that. That's just really nice. Just it's just a simple thing, but my brain can look at that all day and it doesn't get confused. It knows exactly what it's trying to tell me. And that's ultimately what good photography should do. Okay, right, on these ones, got some lovely ones here. I would probably pull that one up if it wasn't portrait mode, but I like the simplicity of this shot. It's really well exposed. The temptation would be to have that brighter, but I think it works well as it is. And as a rule of third, it's pretty much where it needs to be. Can't really fault that too much. Maybe pull that up very slightly, but I don't want to do too much to it because it's really good. But again, I just really love the balance, the empty space. I mean, in an ideal world, you'd have the seagull looking into the empty space, but we can't be too picky, and seagulls are notoriously unreliable creatures when you're trying to bark instructions at them. So I would say that's a really lovely image. And yeah, the only thing you could obviously do is reframe it and just move your composition over. So bring the camera across and have the bird this side so he's looking into the space, but that's about the only improvement I would suggest. We've got some lovely stuff here. I thought this one was particularly interesting. It looks like this has almost been shot with maybe they have with a sort of a macro lens, but I really like the leading lines on this, and the shallow depth of field as well works really, really well. Possibly because it's shot with a macro lens, because these look like very small figures. So I haven't really got an idea for scale on this, but it just works really, really nicely. And you've got your focus point sort of in the middle of this whatever mock building, but it kind of leads in nicely. So you end up sort of looking at the focus bit. And these people here, perhaps if they were the focus point, that might work a little bit better. Just zooming in, they're a little bit soft. I think if you could nail your focus on them, I would say that you could probably have slightly more depth of field on this and it would still work, but you'd have a better chance of getting the focus nailed on these guys. And if you were to do that, I think the leading lines would sort of take you into these people. Or of course, your other option would be to take the focus point to here and have the leading line here take you to this point. But with the position of the lamppost here, that might kind of block the people you're trying to see. But it's always a good idea if you're using leading lines to make sure that the point at the end of those lines is where the eye is going to go to, and that obviously needs to be sharp. So that's the only thing I would say with this, but a really good photo anyway. And then last one, let me have a look on this one. So this one, we've got some lovely sort of late winter light. Recognize that road sign, Burton again. Seem to have picked up quite a lot of Pertonites in this course, which is always good. So with this one, you've got a leading line here. I think it looks to me like the flash in the camera, whatever you're using, has gone off on this, and it's lit up this. I don't know if that's a stick, a fence, or a log or something. But I can see the intention of what you're trying to do, but it's a little bit too bright. So I think I'd disable the flash next time for this one. Also, I can tell you use flash because it's reflecting off this sign. So that's the giveaway for me, even if that wasn't. So you probably don't want your flash on for this because the sun's doing all the lighting for you. So disable the flash, and just, even if this is dark, you can, it will still be visible. You'll still see it, but it doesn't need to be this bright. Also, try and get in the habit of getting your horizons nice and straight. I think that is a bit closer to straight. It just is a little bit, maybe it needs to go a little bit more. But flat horizons are something you definitely want to strive for in any kind of landscape photography. So there you go, guys. I'm sorry I didn't have time to review every single one, but there was some really lovely stuff there, and I really enjoyed looking at it all. I now need to, right, I'm going to go to the Q&A. But first of all, I need to find how I can see you all. Ah, there we go, start video. Hey, I can see people. Guys, if you want to turn microphones and cameras on, I am free for a Q&A for as long as you want to be here. I will give you the 20 minutes I promised, even though we're running late. You are more than welcome to dive off if you've got kids to put to bed or other things to do. It's entirely optional, this part, but fire away.
Sorry, Rafe, I'm going to have to run, but it's Becky, by the way. Thank you. Brilliant.
No worries, Becky. Thank you. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Rafe, Joe here.
Hi, Joe.
I just had a quick question on lenses.
Yeah.
I've got I think, as you know, the Sony A7 III, is it?
Yeah.
And it has a lens which is 28 to 70 zoom lens. As you know, I'm going to be doing a lot of architectural photography, and a lot of what I want to do is sort of elevations of rooms. So getting a sort of as straight a lines as possible of a kitchen or whatever it is. And so I need to be able to appear as far back as I can in a room, but without it looking too wide angle, I guess. I've seen a few lenses that seem to have fixed zoom, I get, or I don't know if it's zoom or not. So it'll just be a 24mm and then a 2.8 f-stop.
Yeah.
How much does that still have flexibility? What and then you see others which are like 12 to 60, and what would be the benefit of getting one that's just 24, say?
Okay, so to give you an idea, Joe, when I do a commercial shoot for one of the construction companies I work for, and I've got to photograph exterior and interior of buildings, I usually do it with two lenses. I have both my cameras around my neck or my shoulders, and I have a 17 to 40 millimeter f4 zoom lens, which is the most affordable Canon zoom wide angle zoom lens. And I have an 85, my regular 85mm, which stops down to 1.4 for doing detail stuff. So if I want to photograph, a door handle because it's a particular feature, then I can isolate it from the background. Because most of the architectural stuff I do requires everything to be sharp and in focus, you don't need to have a lens that stops down to f2.8 or f2 or lower. But I would say for that sort of photography, the flexibility of zoom lenses really pays off, because there have been instances where I've walked into a room with a 24mm fixed prime lens being the non-zoom lens, and it's not been wide enough. And I've had to go back to my bag and put the 17 to 40 on to give me that extra bit of width. Now, as you probably know from your own photography, and obviously being an architect yourself, Joe, I know it's super important for you that you don't have something that looks too contorted. And the problem is, the wider you go, the closer you get to like a fisheye look, all of those straight beams suddenly start coming in like that, and it doesn't look necessarily natural because it's not what the human eye is seeing. So my advice would be, there are two ways around this. There are expensive tilt shift lenses which architects do buy, which you can and I've never used one, but they're expensive, but I've never used one. That might be worth an investment because it's your work, so you could justify having that as a work tool. But I having never used one because I'm primarily a people photographer. The other option is that you know, and we can cover this, and I'll make a point of showing you when we do the editing. You can use the software in Lightroom will auto correct on you know, sort of the wide angle curves. There's a bit of manual work to do, but it's got this way you can sort of pull the image out and, you know, have a wide angle shot of a building, go from sort of that to that, but you still have the wide angle look. So that's kind of your cheap fix option, but it works pretty well. But if you don't allow enough space around the frame, sometimes you lose a bit of the image to do it. The tilt shift is the way around it. But I think I would say if there is a really wide angle zoom in Sony's kit bag that will work on your camera, maybe what you could do, Joe, is you could try it and see if there's a place that does lens hire, because I've hired lenses and tested them for a week. You pay 70, 80 quid or whatever for a week and then decide if you're going to buy it. Because for me, some of my lenses cost nearly £2,000 each, and you know, you want to try before you buy. A lot of money. I don't know what a tilt shift on the Sony would be, but I would think you're going to be around £1,000 for a second-hand one, possibly 1,200, 1,300 quid for a new one. So I would try and find a way of hiring one and have a play with it first.
Yeah.
But I think to answer your question, I think wide angle zoom is probably the best thing for you, so that you've got that flexibility then of, you know, not being limited to one focal length.
Yeah. Cool. All right.
No worries, dude. Anyone else?
Yeah. Hey, Rafe, I had a quick one.
Hi, Sophia.
Hello. Do you use the live view or the viewfinder when you're taking photos?
It's a good question, actually. I use both, and it depends on the situation. So if you were to be, if you're doing something like street photography, for example, or at weddings, if I'm walking around the reception and I'm trying to be as discreet as it's possible to be when you're a 6'8" bloke walking around at a wedding with a camera, I tend to sometimes I go on my sort of stealth mode. And what I'll do is I'll have so I don't know if your camera has it, but if you've got a flip screen at the back that comes out, you can do, just turn it on. So I can pretend I'm sort of looking at images on the back of the camera and be photographing people. So I can hold it down at my waist. Can't really show you here, but I can sort of hold it like here and sort of show you. So I'd hold it like that, and I'd just sort of, you know, fire like that, basically. A bit like a machine gunner, but without the bodies piling up. And that's a good way around it. But then there are times when I want to be more precise, when I'll put the screen away, and you know, I can still use the screen on the back of the camera because it's still a live view. But sometimes for precision, particularly if I'm really trying to nail focus on someone's eyes or something like that, I still find it better to go old school and actually just do that, because I can see, I just feel I've got a much better sight of the focus point moving around by doing that than by doing that. But you know, if you don't want to be seen to be taking photos, you can just, you know, hold it down by your chest and just do that. You can still look at the screen. If it flips out, you can go even lower. You can sort of, you know what I mean, be really discreet with it. So it sort of depends on what your camera can do. But just remind me, what is it you're shooting with? Is it a Canon?
It's a Canon, yeah, 750D. 750D.
Does the screen come out on it?
Yeah, it's the same. Yeah.
It does, great. Yeah, I practice with that. I maybe set yourself a challenge of, I mean, it's difficult now with COVID on because we're not really supposed to be obviously doing certain things, but
yeah.
You know, going around London and trying to get discreet street photography is quite a difficult thing to do, but it'll be a lot easier if you're looking at a flip screen. People won't notice it as much. If you've got a massive, great 70-200 lens and you're peeking around like that, you know, I find in London particularly people give you some dodgy looks. So I try and be as discreet as possible. I put the smallest lens I can get away with on, and I just look like I'm sort of going, no, I'm not sure that's sharp, bang, 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 and then people don't even know it, especially if you put it on silent mode.
So it's more kind of when you're in stealth mode rather than
generally
photography.
I still feel the controls better when I've got my hand up here.
Yeah.
And also I can control, because if I'm there, like I said, you know, my thumb is doing most of the work. It's just flicking around, and it, because I'm taking 10,000 images at a wedding, you know, it's like driving a car. You don't think about it. You just do it enough that you just know what you're doing, and you learn your camera and you know where all the buttons are, and you don't even think about it. You just change them without even comes a subconscious thing. It's easy for me to say because although not at the moment, I'm normally doing it week in, week out. And so it becomes like an extension of your hand. But like everything with this, it's just practice. It's like this manual mode thing might seem a bit scary and a bit intimidating, but practice, practice, practice. You know, you'll get it down in no time. You'll quickly understand that, right, I need more light. What do I do? Right, okay, shutter speed down, slow the shutter speed down, or ISO up. And you'll just do it without having to sort of get out the charts and kind of go, no, what did Rafe say again? Anyway, I'm wandering off at a tangent, but yeah, hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much.
No worries. Anyone else, guys? Please don't be afraid to shout if I can help with anything. There's someone here who rather disconcertingly, his name is iPad Pro 12.9, which is quite interesting.
I've got another question, Rafe, if no one else. You mentioned earlier about the exposure in one of the photos. I think it was the lady sat at the window and how they'd captured really good detail through the window and as well as on her. A lot of the photography I do obviously is going to be out looking through big doors, and I want the building inside to look as light as possible with loads of natural light, but also capture detail beyond, whether it's landscaping or whatever. I found just playing around with my camera that I tend to overexpose because I want the inside to look quite white and light. Is there a way around that, or is it generally just all done in editing afterwards in terms of taking a couple of photos with a couple of exposures and dealing with it that way?
You are unfortunately beholden slightly to the laws of physics on that one, in as much that if you are in a building that is, you know, indoor light and your outdoor light is full sun, and you're trying to get exposures for both, you're going to find that very difficult. And there's no camera in the world that can really do that. There's a very marginal difference with the top end cameras. I mean, you have a very good camera. The A7 III is a camera that a lot of my friends use in the wedding industry, and it's an amazing bit of kit with killer autofocus and the ability to produce really high quality images. So you will have a camera that produces raw files that you can pull a lot out of the shadows, and you can pull a fair bit out of the highlights, whereas a cheaper SLR camera, for example, wouldn't be able to do that. That's one of the things you're paying for by having a higher end camera. It is a case of editing, but you know, it's also consciously, Joe, when you're taking that photograph, if you are in an ability, if you know that's the shot you want and you're photographing a building, then do it on a grayish, slightly overcast day, so that the light outdoors is going to be slightly closer in strength to the light indoors. Because if you've got, for example, the sun is from the side of the building behind you and it's lighting up the ground out in front of you, but it's not lighting up the building that you're in, the difference between the room you're in and what you see outside is going to be far too many light stops for any camera to bridge the gap, even if you edit it. But if you've got the light coming into the room and outdoors, it's more a case of just you assessing with your own eyes and brain the exposure difference and thinking, is that close enough that I can pull it back a bit in Lightroom? Because when we do some editing stuff, I'll try and remind myself to show you how I edit a photo like that when I do architectural work. And I'll show you how I draw the highlights out from outside, and I use radial filters to darken areas around certain bits and do all that. I think that would be really useful for you, because the short answer is you will need to do a lot of editing, but you can make it easy for yourself by looking at the light outside and making a rough assessment on whether you think you're going to get any of that detail from outside. Because I know exactly what you mean. I mean, if you look at really well photographed properties in estate agents, you know, commercial property, for example, where they pay for a really good photographer to come in, you often see that you can see quite a lot of detail out the windows of the outside, because actually the view is part of the selling point for the property, and that you can tell that they've really put some thought into that and probably done a fair bit of editing. You know, like anything, you can ultimately, if you're really good in Photoshop, you can make anything happen. You can just take 2 photographs at different exposures, photograph the view out the garden at one exposure, take a photograph of the room in a very different exposure, and just overlay them in Photoshop and rub out the bits you don't want to see and have perfectly exposed. But I think there's a point where you do that where it starts to look a bit fake, and that's up to you as to how natural or fake you want it to look.
No, I guess I was half beating myself up because I was like, these photos don't look very good. I can't see anything outside, but inside looks really good. And then you do the next one and outside looks great. But and then I was like, maybe it is just a case of doing it in Photoshop. But then, like you said, you end up with an image that doesn't look like it could be real. So I guess it's just getting that balance. And obviously with this camera,
I can understand what you want, because you want nice white, clean kind of walls. You don't want them to be muddy and grey, but you also want that detail behind. It's a difficult one to balance, but you can play around with the highlight slider and the white slider, and you can definitely make things a bit better. And you know, hopefully we'll have time with the editing day that, you know, I can help you with that.
Cool. Thanks, Ray.
No worries. Cool. Anyone else, guys? Well, look, if there's nothing else, I'm going to let you get on with your evenings, and thank you for your attention and patience as always. This has been recorded, so you can watch it all back. I'll drop you an email when it's uploaded to YouTube and send you the link. And it'll be same time again next week. I think the Zoom invite that I sent earlier, I put a recurrence on it, so it should hopefully be valid. The same link should be valid 7:30 next Monday as well. So I will double check that obviously on the day. Homework images, ping them over to me. Any other questions, feel free to contact me direct. I'll try and get back to you as quick as I can. And yes, we will look forward to doing a bit on, I'm going to do a bit on inspiration, I think, next week as well, which I didn't have time to cover. But we'll do a bit on lighting and portraiture next week as well. So look forward to seeing you all then. Have a good week, and speak soon.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Ray.
Ray.
See you guys.
Great.